Hello there, and welcome to another episode of Three Guys and the Word. My name is Andrew Ulmer, and it's always a privilege to be joined by fellow workers Eric Parker and Chris Miller. Looking forward to continuing our study from the book of Ecclesiastes, and I hope that you that are watching will benefit greatly from our discussion. We encourage, of course, to look at the previous episodes where we have begun this study. I believe this will be our fourth discussion in this book. We're going to be picking up in chapter 2 in here in just a moment. But how are you doing this morning, Eric?
I'm doing pretty good. I told Andrew, but I don't know if I mentioned to Chris. My house is at the point where he's starting to fix stuff. So we bought it, hoping that it would, kind of follow that natural trajectory. And it's been pretty good so far. So just little things, little valves and gaskets are starting to go. So we replaced the faucet yesterday. One of my lamps needs probably rewiring, just little things like that. But I am so grateful for a beautiful home to live in and safety and, all the little things too. The fact that I can drive 2 miles away and get a new faucet, and install it is quite a blessing. So very thankful for that and first world problem sort of stuff. So and all just minor stuff so far. So really thankful for that. Chris, how you doing?
Doing good. Like I told you guys, we're starting to really kind of get ready for the season now, starting to get towards the home stretch. So I think I'm pretty much like always busy, it feels like now, which is fine. I would rather be that way than have nothing to do. But looking forward to today. Always look forward to this time. For me, coming off of teaching on Wednesday night, you would think jumping into this Thursday morning would drain your battery more, but I'm the opposite. Kind of just recharges me and gets me ready. So looking forward to jumping in. How you doing, Andrew?
Oh, hanging in there. Glad that we can get together as always. I shared beforehand. Hopefully, things will run smoothly. I share with the guys here that I had a cup of coffee and opened up the car door and slipped out of my hand, and it was like slow motion. Literally, you may have seen those commercials where those things have, and somebody says no, and it's like slow down, and so you can just like literally see it. It felt like forever before it just hit the ground, and that's just the way things go sometimes. And but
Where
anyway,
was it from?
well, I don't want to say any one particular place, but it was just a nearby, closer establishment where we used to go to. So
Oh, okay.
that way, it was something for a change. But uh, let's uh, get ready to pick up in verse 12 of chapter 2. But before that, Chris, if you could turn to our principal verses and remind us of those.
Give me just a second. I got attacked by the mascot.
Okay.
Romans. Yeah, she's in my lap right now. Romans.
Email.
Yeah. Uh, I'm getting like attacked right now. Romans 10:14 through 15 says, How then shall they call on him whom they have not believed, and how shall they believe in him whom they have not heard? How shall they hear without a preacher, and how shall they preach unless they are sent? As it is written, How beautiful are the feet of those who preach the gospel of peace, who bring glad tidings of good things.
Thank you. So we're picking up in Ecclesiastes 2, and what we'd like to do just briefly is kind of just go around and offer a couple thoughts from our last discussion. We covered verses 1 through 11 last time, and really all the physical things in life, all the pleasures, just the accumulation of stuff, that Solomon says, hey, look, you can almost saying that he's speaking not only to those that are would be his initial audience, targeted audience, the Jews, Israelites of his kingdom, but even us today. Say, look, I had the opportunity. I literally had anything at my disposal. I had the very stuff that everybody would want to have, and yet still I felt that there was something was missing. I had treasures galore, and I also had what men seek after in all types of pleasure, and yet that didn't fill me up. And I like how he says in verse 10, says, whatever my eyes desired, I did not keep from them. I did not withhold my heart from any pleasure. And so he just dived right in and just took what this life had, and he just went after it and grabbed a hold of it. Yet, and he ends with that idea that has already been seen multiple times. Verse 11, very last sentence, there was no prophet under the sun. He's like just grabbing after wind, just stuff fleeting, empty, just like life itself under the sun. It doesn't last. There's actually nothing that is of substance. And so thought that should be, hopefully it was an eye-opener, benefit of those hearing then, and so much so it should be for our benefit, of course, reading it, reflecting upon it now. Just what your thoughts were from last time, Eric.
I think you had mentioned the word addiction last week too. I mean, even just the total indulgence, walking into it willfully. Solomon is quite clear here that he was very willful in doing all this. He wanted to stimulate his body with wine. He wanted to do, again, it's a very hedonistic presentation. That's not the first time. That's not the last time that somebody's going to look for fulfillment and pleasure and find out that it's not as fulfilling as a life with God. In fact, at the end of the day, you're going to realize that it's nothing but darkness. And so he's come off the first chapter talking about, everything is vanity. Everything under this sun is vanity. We'll give that caveat because that's important in the book too. Everything under the sun by itself is vanity. He even talked about wisdom in that respect towards the end of the chapter 1. He talked about what's the gain of wisdom? You know more and you die. You know more and you see more, and the more you see and the more you know, the more miserable you become. So he's been very clear about that. He's even done a lot of the things that we would think, wow, that would actually, be great if I could have something like that. He's talking about, I planted gardens, and you think about, walking in a peaceful garden. I mean, that's the height of tranquility for me, at least, to just walk in, take in the flowers, stop and smell the roses sort of thing. Just to be able to indulge that, and have people take care of it too, because, if you have that kind of stuff, it takes a lot of work to take care of it. But if you're not the one working it, then, you can just enjoy it. Of course, there's some benefit to working something too. So, maybe that was part of the problem. But he's doing everything that he could. And he's got all kinds of things. He's got flocks, he's got herds, he's got, trees, he's got slaves, he's got all these sorts of things. And everybody's, waiting on him hand and foot, and he's still miserable. It's really amazing because people have been falling for this trick of the devil for a long, long time. You can have this and it'll make you happy. That's one of Satan's main techniques. He comes at you, if you could just have this, you'd be happy. And then of course you may or may not get it, but if you do end up getting it, it's like, he dangles the carrot in front of you again. He says, well, if you could just have this, then that would take care of that deficiency that you're experiencing. And, we chase after the carrot over and over again. And whole entire systems of thought have been built on this. Epicureanism, for instance, eat, drink, and be merry. Just this total idea of indulgence, hedonism, indulge, and you're going to enjoy your life. That's just not accurate. I referenced the commercial earlier, like when you see the alcohol commercials like Budweiser and stuff. They give this portrait of everybody's happy, everybody's having fun, life is great, and there are no problems. And of course the irony is, like, there's this little tiny fine print at the bottom of it. It's like, please drink responsibly. If you have an alcoholic problem, contact this. It's like the carrot is dangled in front of us and we just keep chasing after it. And Satan loves to hold that carrot in front of us. And we love to chase after the carrot, even though we know the carrot's not going to fill us, even though we know it's a plastic carrot. It's not even a real carrot. We know, but we just keep going. And so Solomon's just like, I crashed into a wall because of this. I really thought hedonism was going to be good, but he found out, just like I said, like a lot of others have found out, it's not fulfilling. Chris?
I don't want to approach it from a different angle. You have, like, if you put Solomon's resume up, it's a pretty impressive resume. David pleads with God to let him build the temple, and God tells David, I'm going to let your son build it. So the temple was constructed by Solomon. Solomon oversaw that process, which to me would be probably one of the most, at that time, it was probably one of the most fulfilling moments of his life. Probably ends up being one of the most fulfilling anyway, when he sits down and thinks about it. You have that. You have wisdom. We had talked either last week or the week before, that case where Solomon has to hear it kind of as a judge between the two women with the baby. Like, all those things, it's like, this man is so impressive for him to come up with that conclusion. And even though he does foolish things, I'm still impressed with him. But he literally is the most up and down, one of the most up and down people that we read of. He's a lot like his dad in a lot of ways, but he even goes further than his dad did in a lot of things that David fell short in. I'm impressed when I read this. And like I said, I read it before. I'm like, he's just a cynical old man. No, this is a guy that tried and exhausted everything he could, and he's frustrated because it didn't work. It's not he hates life and he hates everything. He's trying to come to the conclusion this does not suffice. And like Eric had said, I think I brought it up every week since he said it. Those who learn from history are not going to repeat it. They watch other people repeat it. But if you don't learn from it, you're going to repeat it. So you have Solomon, you have all these things that he kind of gets into, immerses himself in, and it doesn't work. And we do a lot of similar things, and we're surprised that it doesn't work. And he talks about there's nothing new under the sun. Solomon tried to find pleasure in everything he could, other than the place I think he knew he could find pleasure. The place he could find pleasure was with God. And he had experienced that probably before he started trying all these other things. So, he kind of ruined a good thing he already had. And sometimes as Christians, we do the same thing. We leave God behind trying to find it somewhere else when we know where we found it in the first place. But he's, as I said, I think that if you're studying along with this with us, you should read about Solomon's life, because he is a very fascinating person. And the more you know about his story, the more powerful I think these verses really are, because we're not talking about somebody who's writing from a place of, well, I didn't do this, so this is meaningless. We're talking about a guy who experienced all this. This was his life, and he's writing it down so I don't fall into the same trap. which I appreciate.
All right. Let's read the next section, which will be, let's do verses 12 through 17. And Eric, if you would please do so.
Ecclesiastes 2:12. So I turned to consider wisdom, madness, and folly. For what will the man do who will come after the king except what has already been done? And I saw that wisdom excels folly, as light excels darkness. The wise man's eyes are in his head, but the fool walks in darkness. And yet I know that one fate befalls them both. Then I said to myself, as is the fate of the fool, it will also befall me. Why then have I been extremely wise? So I said to myself, this too is vanity. For there is no lasting remembrance of the wise man as with the fool, inasmuch as in the coming days all will be forgotten, and how the wise man and the fool alike die. So I hated life, for the work which had been done under the sun was grievous to me, because everything is futility and striving after wind. So, again, here we are almost to the point of like, I don't know exactly how much this translated over, but almost like suicidal. I mean, like, what's the point? The bad guy dies and the good guy dies. The good guy usually dies doing something good. So what's the point? I mean, there are places in the Bible where you even have faithful individuals. It seems like the straw broke the camel's back. I mean, Elijah is a classic example of that. Jeremiah is an example of that. Jonah is a great example of that. And the end of Jonah's like, I just want to die, because this isn't even. Of course, with Jonah, he wants to die because God's taking care of people. That's a little overly simplistic for Jonah. Jonah, the Assyrians and Ninevites had come and butchered a lot of his friends and ancestors. So, you could understand that to a degree, but, the forgiveness that was extended. But there are times in the Bible where people feel miserable, and it is consuming. And, I think that can be helpful for a lot of people today, because life can be too much sometimes. It really can. It can be too much, and it can be crushing, and the despair can creep in. And so you look at examples like this and you see how they work through it, and it helps to, teach you coping mechanisms and how to work through this. Of course, Solomon, his whole entire point of this book is not to be a cynical old man, right, Chris? It's not to be a cynical old man. It's to say, here's a solution. And the solution is in God, having a fully committed life to God, because otherwise it doesn't matter. He talks about kind of a comparison between wisdom and folly. He does wisdom and folly and madness. It's like, I try to live like a wise person. I try to live like just an absolutely insane person. I went across the spectrum to try and figure out, is there some comparative difference between this? And comparatively speaking, he says living a life of wisdom is better, because it's, light as opposed to darkness. But then he comes back to this conclusion. He says, but the wise man and the fool are both going to die. So, it offers no substantial difference. We might say it offers no difference if there's nothing beyond carnality. If there's nothing beyond the flesh, then what's the difference? I mean, if you're gonna die, you're gonna die. So you can heap up momentary pleasures until that moment of death, or you can live a life of self-denial until the moment of death, but you're both gonna die. And so if there's nothing beyond death, then it doesn't matter. If you're put to death for being a mass murderer, you're going to die. You're going to cease to exist. If you work your entire life selflessly, work for a nonprofit or whatever, ancient nonprofit. If you just administer charitable donations and things all your life, you're going to die. and it's not going to mean anything. So again, this is comparatively speaking. If you don't have hope beyond the grave, then the grave is consuming. It's appointed for man once to die, and that's it. From the perspective of living under the sun. So I've heard some quotes along those lines, and it can be really consuming, and that's the beauty of a relationship with God, is that when you're living under the sun and you find those moments where you feel like you're starting to get consumed, or maybe you're really in that that sort of existential dread starts creeping in and sort of devouring you, you can pull out. Because of hope in God and trust in God and saying, you know what, things might not all be made right on this side of death, but I entrust God, who is faithful to administer a perfect judgment, and wrong things will be made right. If you don't have that, then it doesn't matter. So that's his whole point here. Again, it's comparatively, wisdom is better than folly, is better than living like as an insane person. But sort of in this existential fear, in this sort of lasting sense, they're both going to die. So you need something beyond that. You need something beyond this life to activate and actualize value that will pull you out of that dread. Chris?
Once again, no mention of God, but a lot of mentions of I. That's kind of a common theme we've seen so far. He's thinking in of himself, how can he find his purpose? And it's impossible to find your purpose without God, like Eric had brought up. I kind of chuckled to myself, though, when he says, I consider wisdom, madness, and folly. And then he says, as it happens to the fool, it also happens to me. Why was I then more wise? Well, technically, if you think about it, the experiment he does is not very wise. It's kind of foolish. And he's like, well, why am I wise? And the fool, he experiences. And I think Solomon kind of misjudged himself a little bit. There were probably plenty of times God looked at him and was like, how foolish are you, man? You're just like your dad in some ways. Your dad was a man after my own heart, but you've gone even further than your dad. Another part that kind of made me laugh was, for what can the man do who succeeds the king? It's funny that Solomon does a lot of good things after his dad. David was far better than Saul before him, but after Solomon, most of the kings are bad, and they're far worse than Solomon. They're far worse than David. So it's like, well, what can they do? Well, in Rehoboam's case, he makes things worse. And you can't always blame a parent's influence, but you kind of have to wonder if Rehoboam was shaped by a lot of the things that Solomon had experienced. And I think that's why a lot of the Proverbs are written that way to my son in a lot of ways. Hey, don't do something that I did. Don't fall into the same traps I did. And I kind of wonder, when Solomon's writing this, he doesn't talk a lot about, his kids and, his influence and the choices that he made. But I almost wonder if that's on his mind too, because his experiment here, like Eric had talked about, he had people tending the vineyards. He had people tending all the different tasks that he was doing. Other people were building the temple. He was instructing them to do it. He wasn't out there building it himself. He was telling them what to do. How many people were affected by what Solomon was doing? Him being the king, the whole kingdom in a sense is affected. So it kind of goes back to us too. Like, we always are a lot of times so worried about our walk with God, but our walk does impact a lot of people. Maybe we don't have as much of a reach as Solomon has, but you're around somebody and you say something like Solomon, therefore I hated life. Why? Yeah, everyone dies, but Christians look at death differently than non-Christians do. We look at it as, kind of a stepping stone to something much better. And you can tell a difference. I know you guys have probably experienced it too. You go to a funeral of someone who's a faithful child of God. Obviously, people are sorrowful. They're going to grieve and miss that person, but there's just a different type of vibe to it. When people die without the hope of Christ, you can sense there's a different type of vibe to that too. So in Solomon's case here, wherever he is in his life, if you had everything at your access and you tried everything, it would get to the point where it's like, what's kind of the point of this? Like, I've done everything I can. Now what? But when you're living for something beyond this life, it's going to take you a lot longer to ever get to that point. And the thing about this is, before I pass on to Andrew, to me, the weird thing is we're not talking about someone who's an atheist who doesn't believe in the existence of God here. I think Solomon still believes in God. He believes God exists because of what he says at the end of the book. But he lives his life in a lot of ways, like a fool, doing things that don't please God. And then he wonders why he gets the results he gets. So, looking at this section, it kind of, a simple equation to me: God equals meaning. Lack of God equals confusion. Solomon is confused. What is the purpose of life? I've done all these things. It's not working. It doesn't suffice. Well, guess what? I've been in that position before too. The commonality in that is removing God from your plans, from your decision making, from your purpose. That's where he's fallen into this trap, and he feels stuck. And even as Christians, sometimes I think we can kind of get into those ruts where we feel stuck too. And we push God away. That's what Solomon kind of does with his choices. But he finds out he needs him a lot more than he realizes. Andrew?
I feel it would have been interesting just both to see people's expression, the initial audience, as they are listening to Solomon, and how they would have been receiving these. You can almost get kind of like, man, the king's talking like this. Like, where is he going with this? He's someone all over the place. This man has everything. He's been, we've seen his acts of wisdom, and I wonder if they would be kind of like shaken by what he's saying right here. And I like how in this specific section that was read, because I know I've experienced this, that there's like this moment of sobriety that you see in here, a moment of clarity. Yeah, death comes to us all. And yeah, at one point in time, I think that some of us, maybe all of us, go through this period where we got this thinking of, well, death won't get me. It's a devil talking, of you're like the exception. That the 100% effect rate of death is going to somehow bypass me. Of course, if the Lord comes back, will be changed and it'll be different. But generally speaking, of course, death has 100% success rate. But somehow there's this delusion that there's this, well, I'm strong, I'm full of vigor, I can do whatever I want, and there'll be no consequences. But here, Solomon, I get a real sense that he has this moment of clarity of, yeah, I've been king. I have been able to experience having wisdom granted to me, yet I've also gone to the very edge of the opposite, and thought about and lived according to what is foolish. And yeah, one is better than the other, but at the end of the day, all's going to be the same. All roads lead to one end. And it is sort of, as I believe Chris is talking about, yeah, there's just going to be this almost depressive sadness. Well, it's just death. And what else is there that's to look for? And I know we're going to get to that eventually, what we need to put our hope in, because that's why life is worth living at the end of the day. But there is much to benefit that, yeah, even the king can have the perspective of, yeah, life can have its challenges. It's not all it's cracked up to be if you're given stuff, and even if you try to live for the now and experience everything, there's not much substance there, and it's just going back to that lacks. You can see behind me there's all these books, and you can imagine if Solomon just read all these books and accumulated all this knowledge, and at the end of the day say, well, what now? There's still, I feel empty. Well, I've not left this room. I've read all these books. Let me go venture and find out what's out there. Okay, I've experienced all that. Still feel empty. What else is there? And so I like how he is an example for someone who's experienced life to its fullest. And again, we're talking about things under the sun, not things of heaven. And he'll get to those things that are of heaven. He's just making sure we understand without a shadow of a doubt that so far grasping for earthly things is it's not going to be able to something to ultimately hold on to, and it's going to be sustainable. So very good section. Chris, if you would please read verses 18 through 23.
It says, then I hated all my labor in which I had toiled under the sun, because I must leave it to the man who will come after me, and who knows whether he will be wise or a fool. Yet he will rule over all my labor in which I toiled, and in which I have shown myself wise under the sun. This also is vanity. Therefore I turned my heart and despaired of all the labor in which I had toiled under the sun. For there is a man whose labor is with wisdom, knowledge, and skill, yet he must leave his heritage to a man who has not labored for it. This also is vanity and a great evil. You said to 22, right?
23.
23, okay.
For all 23.
Through 23, okay. For what has man for all his labor, and for the striving of his heart, with which he is told under the sun? For all his days are sorrowful, and his work burdensome. Even in the night his heart takes no rest. This is also vanity. Verse 18 and 19 kind of go along with what I'd said earlier. He's referencing who's going to take his place, and his son is far worse than him, and he is foolish. He asked God had told David, I'm not going to split the kingdom up until after Solomon. And Solomon's son, Rehoboam, comes along, and you've got 10 of the tribes feuding with him being of the house of Judah and the house of Benjamin. And he goes and he asks, the leaders, the wise leaders, the council, what he should do, and they give him good advice. And then he asks his friends what he should do, and they give him terrible advice, and he follows the wrong advice. And that kind of leads to that. You lead by example. And Solomon, you think of David, all the good things David does, and Solomon really kind of expands everything. I mean, the nation of Israel was very strong under the reign of Solomon. And like we pointed out throughout a lot of these discussions so far, all the different things Solomon's doing at that period of time, not many world leaders would have been doing the things Solomon was doing, thinking about things that no one else would think about. He has all these accomplishments with this resume, and it literally only takes his son in that generation to kind of ruin a lot of it. So it's like Solomon's got all these credentials, all these things he's done, and it took one generation to mess a lot of that up. And I think that's kind of the depressing thing about it. We can't live forever on earth. So Solomon couldn't protect his accomplishments forever. One day he was going to die, and what he has done was going to be passed on to the next generation. And guess what happens? They mess it up. I mean, you think of our generation in a lot of ways, and it happens like that over time. Certain generations are stronger in things. They pass it on to the next generation. The next generation may not have those same talents and abilities. Things go to waste. It kind of reminds me of that picture people talk about. You don't see a hearse pulling a U-Haul. Uh, Solomon could take his accomplishments with him. And the temple that he built, it wasn't going to last forever. We know later on in the Old Testament, it ends up being destroyed. So you've got all these different things that happen in his life, and he comes to the conclusion, like, what's the purpose of all of it? Someone that's going to come after me is going to be foolish and mess it up, which is very depressing when you think about it. If that's what your hope and your trust is in. To me, once again, this is just, it's saturated in a lot of ways here of thinking about just now, thinking about the physical, thinking about the temporary. You've not seen really him talk about eternity at all. We haven't seen him talk about God very much. You're seeing the mindset is so dwelling on the physical, and that's depressing. Because, if you think about it, the world's probably worse than when all three of us were born. And Eric, probably when your kids are our age, if we continue on this trajectory, if Christ don't return first, it's probably going to be worse. It just is progression we see in society. And Solomon probably felt that way. Look at all these good things I've done. And the world still is, a bad place. People still do things they're not supposed to do. And I think a lot of times I'm kind of a control freak in a lot of ways. You want to control everything and fix everything and do everything right. But the rest of the world don't see it that way. And I think that's what Solomon's seeing. All this good I've done, somebody's going to come and mess it up. And that is depressing, especially if you think about maybe, well, obviously we don't know this, maybe he was thinking about Rehoboam and he's like, this kid's just a piece of work. He's going to mess up everything I ever did. He's going to mess everything up. Or, my further descendants, someone's going to come along and they're going to mess everything up. Just a very depressive state, I think. I think he kind of realizes how futile all this stuff is. Yeah, it's pretty impressive, my resume, but it's not going to last. Eric.
Yeah, I was just thinking, use your illustration of a resume. At the end of the day, it's a piece of paper.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I think this section in particular is really helpful because we tend to have two extremes in our particular society. One is that people just don't work. They're just looking for somebody to pay the way. Sort of the. I don't want to get into political stuff, but there's some people that don't. They just don't work. They don't work and they just complain and bicker and moan, and they expect everybody else to sort of pay all their bills for them and whatnot. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have people that are workaholics. I mean, it's hard to find somebody nowadays who only works 40 hours. Like it's almost unheard of now. And there are a lot of contributing factors to that, obviously. But and then years ago, of course, it was like a single income that a family would live on, and you could support, you could have bigger families. You could have 6-8 kids on a single income and probably have some, big estate, if you had a good job. But then, a lot of things have happened to contribute to that. But we definitely have a problem with workaholism in our country. I mean, there's no doubt about that. I mean, wherever you are on the political spectrum, wherever you are on why things are as expensive as they are, there are some people who seem to find a degree of a meaning of their life in working. But it's, I think it was originally put in a paper or something. Somebody just wrote something in, and it talked about, if you die, that business is just going to hire somebody else to do your job for you. If you're not around for your wife or your kids, you're missing it. Now we have to work. I mean, that's just how it is. If you're not willing to work, then you shouldn't, neither shall you eat, sort of thing, right? And a man who doesn't care for his own is just as bad as an infidel in 1 Timothy 5. So we think about this, and we think about, some necessities of life. I mean, sometimes jobs don't pay as much as they should. Sometimes, you need insurance or whatever. So sometimes there's difficulties that arise there, and sometimes you do have to work 2 jobs to make things get by, especially kind of in our certain current economic environment. So there are some challenges, but I think there are a lot of people who have that workaholic mentality of, this is my meaning in life. This is what I do. And they'll work, 70, 80 hours a week. And some people feel like they need to, but I think honestly, a lot of people that do that because they feel some degree of fulfillment in it. But Solomon's like, no, that's fleeting too, because, the more you work, of course, the more you can start breaking down, realize this isn't going to last forever. This isn't going to last forever. So I could work my whole life to build this vast empire, and somebody will blow it up in a hot minute. And that's just kind of how things are. And yeah, it's troubling and despairing. Despairing is the mood of Ecclesiastes. Life under the sun is full of despair. And he turns his heart to despair, kind of in the middle of that section. That's how rough it is. But that's under the sun. You use that phrase there in verse 19, for which I labored by acting wisely under the sun. This too is vanity. So things under the sun without something beyond the veil, that's vanity. Andrew?
Well, just thinking about how many generations, let's say men starts a company or builds up a business, and how they have to decide, and sometimes with great mental distress, of deciding how it's going to be administered after their passing, or having to leave it, and they struggle with that. Or maybe they have to step down even before they die, that they have to see how things are run, where they have to, for whatever reason, step away. That's hard, and a lot of people struggle with that, seeing how what they've accomplished with their own hands and their mind, and then turn it over, relinquish what they have worked so hard to build. And certainly they are afraid, because that has been their whole life. That is what, in many cases, defined them. Work, unfortunately, defines a lot of people. That's where they find their meaning. And it gets to the point of it consumes them. That, okay, the moniker on the building, if it's got my name, or if I own a piece of property that's in my name, and I work off the land, or whatever it may be, that defines me. And when at the end of the day, at some point, it's no longer going to be mine. And that sounds very depressing, that all that I am, all that these people who live to build something and put all their energy into a particular field. They may have established themselves in some sense, but there's this great letdown. I'm going to have to turn it over, even though it may be family members, people that you love and care for. You just don't know if it's going to fall apart. And in some instances, they may experience seeing that fall apart. And then there's, at the end of the day, there's nothing left. How empty. You feel like an empty shell. You built everything up. You strive hard. You, in a sense, were under the sun successful. Or under the sun, you built it up, and then there's this uncertainty of what will happen. And if that's all that there is, then that, again, emptiness, vanity. And so life and work, that's not what all it can be. Life can't be all about work. There's obviously a place for it. It goes back to the very beginning that men were and women were supposed to be busy. They're supposed to be doing stuff, but it wasn't supposed to be that which all is consuming. All right, let's finish up these last 3 verses, which I'll read. Beginning verse 24, nothing is better for a man than that he should eat and drink, that his soul should enjoy good in his labor. This also I saw was from the hand of God. For who can eat or who can have enjoyment more than I? For God gives wisdom and knowledge and joy to a man who is good in his sight. But to the sinner he gives the work of gathering, collecting, that he may give to him who is good before God. It's also as vanity and grasping for the wind. So this is, there was one mention of God back in chapter 1 and verse 13. This is really the first time where he gives more attention to God and is starting to highlight more of things than just under the sun. And he said that a person should find some pleasure and enjoyment from his labor. And there is value in working a good, hard day's work. When you've had the ability to wipe sweat from your brow, and or you've been able to accomplish task that you've set out for you, and you could say, all right, I did what was on the schedule for me to do. There's great value in that and feeling accomplished. Verse 25, the reality is who shouldn't have greater enjoyment in this life or in their personal labors than I. That's a self-inventory, self-reflection, as I think is very beneficial for us to do, not just go through this life without having that reflection, as Solomon is just very much going through. It's saying, as we've seen, example after example of where he is given a personal inventory of his life. And this is just a great book for that, and how valuable that it is that. But in the end of the day, if you have lived your life where God's not been involved, and he uses the description of someone who is involved in, and made a practice of sinning, very much, of course, someone who's outside of that relationship with God, they really have no hope, obviously, or anything to look forward to. Their work is going to fall into somebody that God chooses to give to. So there truly is their life and what they have put together with their own two hands or whatever. They may have been a hard worker, or they may have gotten things through illegal, immoral ways, whatever, but their life was not godly. And so they, even more so, their ultimate end and what they've put through or done under the sun has been meaningless, because it's going to go to somebody that God ultimately chooses. And so again, he just lays things out, and we can take heed to his word, because what he has had to say is very practical and logical, very logical in his thinking and presentation. Chris, your thoughts on these last three verses?
Well, verse 24, he repeats similar phrasing of that 5 times throughout Ecclesiastes. So he's trying to give us some advice here on how to really make the best out of a bad situation. If life is meaningless, if life has no purpose, then why not just eat and drink? I mean, if you're going to die anyway, and all of us die, and God redistributes everything, why not just eat and drink and be merry and not have any type of concern of anything else? If you're going to die anyway, why not enjoy the time you have here? And there's that physical mindset. We prepare for something after this. That's why we have purpose and meaning. Solomon does mention God here in verse 24, but it's almost like, to me, the way I read verse 24, he's basically saying, well, God gives you the things to eat and the things to drink so you enjoy your time here. He's still not thinking of God in like the eternal aspect. He's thinking of God kind of in the temporary sense. So it's like, to me, the way I view it, you can acknowledge that God exists and still live like an atheist. You know, Christians, quote unquote, can say that God exists, but you can live your life as if God is absent. Solomon, in a way, knows that God exists. There's not any information that I can read of in the Bible that would ever convince me that Solomon was an atheist, because, you know, God literally says, what do you want? And he tells God that early on. He knew that God was real. He knew that God existed. And I almost wonder, you know, like Andrew had mentioned, it would be amazing to have sat in that room and hear Solomon read this to his audience. I almost wonder if any of those people were thinking, your dad was a man after God's own heart. You built the temple for God. You had close fellowship with God, that God asked you whatever you wanted, you could have. And look at what you've done with your life. Eating and drinking? He could ask God for all the food and all the drinks in the world when God said, what do you want? He said, I want wisdom. I want wisdom to govern the people. That's what I want. And, you know, I think that's kind of what we do too. It's like God gives you what you need, in a sense, to make the best out of a terrible situation here. No, God just doesn't care about our temporary situation here. He ultimately wants us to spend eternity with him. And sometimes maybe the reason these things weren't fulfilling to Solomon, maybe God was trying to send Solomon a message saying, hey, I can make you feel satisfied. All these other things can't. And I think, in a way, if you think about it, with Solomon having 700 wives, with him having 300 concubines, with all that influence, we do know at times Solomon did commit idolatry because of them. But also, I think Solomon commits idolatry from his possessions and the things that he has, because he puts them in the wrong spot. In verse 26, he said, God gives wisdom and knowledge and joy to a man who is good in his sight. Okay, yeah, that's true. But to the sinner, he gives the work of gathering and collecting, that he may give to him who is good before God. This is also vanity and grasping for the wind. You know, living for God is not vanity and grasping for the wind. And it's interesting, you're seeing this, you know, he's kind of walking a tightrope. He's not telling you, well, because I don't have God in my life is meaningless. He's basically saying, well, God's kind of playing a part in a little bit of this too, where, you know, he gives men wisdom, he gives them knowledge, he gives them joy. I bet if you looked at Solomon's life and probably asked Solomon when he was the happiest in his life, I bet he could probably trace it back to when he was closest with God. Guarantee it. And his dad could definitely tell you that too. You read some of the Psalms that David pens. I think it's Psalm 51 where he talks about how he's brokenhearted at his sin. And he basically, in a sense, begs God to forgive him. And you think of when his child is sick and going to pass away. In that period of time, he didn't have anything to do with anybody else other than God. He was praying to God. You know, and Solomon witnessed not David, king of Israel, man after God's own heart. That was his own father. And some of the ways David lacked, Solomon lacked too. And really kind of this end section just kind of makes me think of idolatry. You know, you can put anything in the place of God. And Solomon, through this section we've read the last 2 weeks, put everything he could in the place of God. And it did not work. So like Eric had pointed out, you know, the beer commercials or, you know, the gambling commercials that are like everywhere now in Kentucky because it's been legalized. All kinds of different things. You know, the world's always trying to throw something in our face saying this will make you happy. This will satisfy you. But if you gave Solomon a 30-second commercial where he could speak to people, he would tell you it wouldn't. Only God can satisfy, and only a proper perspective of God can satisfy. Not just acknowledging God's existence, but acknowledging that God is the source of all good things that we have in this life, and ultimately the hope we have beyond this life. I kind of want to give, I just want to give Solomon a hug. Say, man, it's okay. It's okay. You know what you need to do. And it's a good reminder to me that I know what I need to do too, and to have God in his proper throne in my life. What you got, Eric?
Well, it's no coincidence that one of the high points in the book is just saturated with God language, in contrast to the surrounding text. You know, I think that was probably a rhetorical strategy on Solomon's part. You know, by not mentioning God in these other sections, he's sort of implicitly saying, you know, if God's absent, meaning's absent. And then he starts talking about meaning, and immediately he's mentioning God. He's like, you want meaning in life? You got to have God. God can give you meaning, and even the simpler things of life, eating and drinking. I mean, you got to do that multiple times a day usually. So, you know, even in sort of the monotonous routine of life, then there can be meaning. He talks about telling yourself that your labor is good. I think there's something to be said about that too. You know, I think it is a little, I'm not necessarily a big fan of like to stand in front of the mirror and say, you know, sort of the self, what do they call those things? Stand in front of the mirror and you're like, you're valuable. And
like self-validation.
Yeah, like
Motivation.
self-validation. Like, I'm not a necessarily a big fan of that, but I do think that there are some people that really struggle, and maybe that's more valuable for them. I do know that work is a big part of our life, especially in this country. And so I think you do need from time to time to say what I'm doing is important. You know, I've talked to all sorts of different people with all sorts of different jobs, and sometimes you just feel like, you know, what's the point? And Seinfeld, the character Newman, I watched it as a teenager. I think I've watched it for years for obvious reasons, but you know, Newman at one point, the mailman, he's like, the mail just keeps coming and coming and coming and coming, and it never stops. And he's talking about this idea, and he kind of has this little monologue where he's talking about the mail keeps coming and coming and coming. And it's just like, it just is kind of overwhelming, but at the same time, it's, you know, what's the point? And I talked to a truck driver one time. He had a kind of a low view of himself, and he's like, what do I know? I'm just a dumb truck driver. And he just kind of getting down on himself. And I'm like, you know, and it kind of down on himself in respect to his job too. And I was like, well, you're actually blessing a lot of families and a lot of businesses and supporting a lot of people. I mean, you are an integral part of the logistics, supporting businesses and supporting families. And so you get to, be this sort of hand in the glove to help out with all these people. You're impacting all these different people. And I think that was helpful for him because he was sort of getting down on himself. And so you think about that, and I don't know, it could be as simple as just being a food preparer at a restaurant or something, or delivering food to people, whatever. Like, people need food, so you're helping with an essential need, and somebody who otherwise would go without, you're helping them go with. So I think it's important to do some degree of validation there in respect to our labor. But really, I mean, this whole section is just saturated with God. You put God in here, and there's going to be meaning, and there's going to be not just like a basic meaning, like, okay, I got something to hold on to. It's actually like a rich meaning. It's a sort of a rich endowment of meaning that not only helps you to get through, but helps you to excel. God made people to excel. He didn't make slouches. He didn't make. That's why I think the Bible is so intent on condemning like sloth and laziness, because God didn't make you to just sit around all day. He didn't make you to sit around and be a couch potato all day. He wants you to get up and move and do stuff. He made you with special talents to do those sorts of things. Don't get lost in only those sorts of things, but do those things as a means of glorifying God. And when you do that, then it does have meaning. It has not just a base meaning, but actually a rich meaning, a very rich meaning. Working hard, eating well, drinking well, all these sorts of things can lead to a meaningful life, because we have to understand that our flesh is God's sanctified vessel for our spirit. I don't think we realize that enough. Like we're so used to making a distinction between the flesh and the spirit, which is true. Obviously the spirit and the flesh can be at war with one another, but at the same time, I mean, God put our spirits into this, so there has to be also an implicit connection here, an explicit connection, where you've got the flesh and the spirit working together. So there's got to be an integration of self, and that integration of self comes from a faithful relationship with God. And if you don't have that, it will always feel like you're grasping for straws and coming up short. But if you have that, if you have God in your life, then you can be a fully integrated self, and that's very, very important, because we have a whole world of people who are struggling with basic identity issues. If you have God in your life, then you can have an integral, self-integrated self, a fully integrated self, and that can help you stay strong and excel, and move forward in life, and do meaningful things for our meaningful Creator based on a meaningful relationship.
Well, thank you again for the discussion, and hopefully you that have been watching have found it beneficial, and that it's given much to think about. We hope that you have been encouraged and also challenged as we seek to better understand what God's will is, what He has written down in His Word. May we ever seek each day to do what He has commanded us to do. And so we're hope that our hope is that you are constantly seeking, that you're constantly desiring to know who God is. But maybe you're struggling. Maybe you don't know where to begin. Maybe you've had a strong relationship, but have since strayed and not being connected with God's word, and you're just maybe all over the place. Wherever you may be at, we just want and encourage you to get back into the word, or deepen your studies into what God has revealed. And please reach out to us if you need whether encouragement, prayers, want to talk about things that are written in Scripture. We just want to make sure that we're all are all on that narrow path, that Jesus himself said will lead home to the eternal home of heaven. And you can reach out to Chris at the Shively Church of Christ Facebook page, or you can reach Eric or myself at the Taylorsville Road Church of Christ Facebook page, or TaylorsvilleRDChurchofChrist.com. Again, feel free to reach out and connect to us. And we just want to make sure that we're doing what he finds pleasing in his sight and brings him glory. And we thank you for tuning in, and we hope that you will plan on joining us next week, Lord willing, when we'll have another episode of Three Guys in the Word. And until then, may God bless you and take care.